Welcome to the Quick 10 podcast, brought to you by Trac, focusing on all things FedCon and cyber defense from different perspectives and different personalities, all in 10-ish minutes. Here's your host, Derek White.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Quick 10 podcast. Very excited today to have none other than Bob Metzger joining me today, who is a leading cyber lawyer who heads the cybersecurity practice at Rogers, Joseph, O'Donnell, PC, a law firm that specializes in government contracts. And is Bob's one of the most respected voices in the cyber defense community, in my opinion. Bob, great seeing you again.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well,
I
first
appreciate
things
it, and I
first.
hope not to lose that respect in the course of this podcast.
Well, that's always the risk we have when people join, you know.
All right, let's go.
That's up to you. Yeah. Here's the first thing we got to do, though, is we've got a very clear disclaimer that you need to get out before we get going.
I do. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this podcast and to work with Derek, who I've known for some time. However, my participation is not an endorsement of the Cuick Trac solution or of any other service or solution provider. Also, I am a lawyer, I have to admit it, but what you hear now is not legal advice. It's just information in the form of my opinion. No legal advice.
Perfect. Well, that's the beauty of the podcast, is that we're not out here slinging products and services, just passionate people having passionate conversations to provide clarity and perspective on what can be a very complicated space. And that definitely became somewhat true and somewhat clear here recently that we're going to get into. But yeah, as always, if you're a first timer, welcome. It's a pretty simple concept here. If you're a regular, welcome back. Always subscribe, follow all that wherever you get your podcasts fix. And we're on YouTube as well, so you can watch there. So, Bob, your background, I don't usually spend a lot of time getting into people's backgrounds. I feel like they can go look that up. Yours, though, on the other hand, is very impressive and unique even. And so I want to just say a couple things first before we get into the topic so people know where your opinions are coming from, where your experience comes from here. So I'm going to read some of this off here too. But in 2017, you served on the Defense Science Board Cyber Supply Chain Report Task Force, and you were a co-author of the MITRE Delivered on Compromise report, which everybody should read if you haven't already, which has influenced federal security measures, including CMMC. And then you also serve as a consultant for MITRE. You worked on cyber software assurance, supply chain, ransomware, CMMC, and other projects. And in 2016, Federal 100 awardee, which is great. That's congrats on that. But then more recently, 2024, you were honored in LawDragon's inaugural 500 Leader Global Cyber Lawyers Guide, which is also pretty awesome. So I can go on and on there, but we don't have that much time. So impressive background, Bob. Thanks again for joining. I think it's, here we are being recording on November 1st. And so the very recent news is the CMMC rule update and the immediate impact. I want to talk, actually let you talk as part of the discussion on that first and foremost before we get into a couple other items.
Sure. Well, let's dive in. December 26, 2023, DoD published a proposed regulation that would be the CMMC Program rule. It was intended to be in 32 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 170. And this is the part of CMMC that tells DoD what it's going to do and informs contractors of of the purposes of DoD as well as the operations that DoD intends to oversee. It is a key part to the puzzle of completing all of the regulatory activities before CMMC is final and effective and appearing as a contract requirement. Well, on October 16th, DoD published the final 32 CFR Part 170 CMMC Program rule. It took them only 10 months to adjudicate all the comments they'd received. And this rule is final in the sense that it is out in the Federal Register for all to see, but 60 days are needed before the rule actually takes effect. And that means that the CMMC program will be effective as of December 16th, a little bit more than a month from now. This is a very significant event, even though the counterpart contract rule at Title 48 is still in process. We'll talk about that later.
Mhm.
Well, for a year or more, DoD has been working with contractors and certified third-party assessment organizations, C3PAOs, to conduct joint surveillance assessments. These are things that anticipate CMMC, where you can work with a C3PAO under the oversight of the DIBCAC unit of DCMA and essentially go through the assessment process and get a validation that you have met the requirements of the 7012 clause and of the NIST SB 800-171 cybersecurity standards. Well, the JSVA has been important for the people that are already in and through it, but it is now fading out because it's becoming clear that as of December 16th, there will be no more new joint surveillance assessments since those preceded or anticipated the formal CMMC program. DoD has said explicitly that as of December 16th, that companies can go to a C3PAO and have an assessment conducted by that C3PAO to establish that they meet the CMMC Level 2 requirements. Those requirements apply to roughly 80,000 companies, according to DoD's estimate. This does put some companies in a bit of a tough spot because some number of enterprises went through the JSV already, had some gaps or poems to close, and are now struggling to finish those before December 15th because of this current cliff on the 16th. So what's going to happen now that CMMC program is in effect? Well, you're not going to receive contract clauses immediately that demand that you pass a certification assessment. That's because the Title 48 CFR rule is where you will see the contract measures to implement the CMMC program. DoD received on October 16th, as I recall, the comments of stakeholders to the proposed 48 CFR rule. It's likely to take DoD 8 to 10 months to act upon those comments. We will not see a final CMMC Title 48 rule published until probably the end of the first quarter in 2025. And if you add the 60 days that are always required before effectiveness of a published final rule, that means that you will not see CMMC final rule, Title 48 of the CFR with the program rule all operative and in effect until the end of the first quarter, or maybe the second quarter of 2025. Now, does that mean that you should take comfort because this thing is rolling slowly? I don't think so, because it is a profound event that the 32 CFR program rule is final. And it is very significant that DoD has said already that it will honor C3PAO certification assessments that are conducted anytime after the December 16th that's coming up in roughly 6 weeks. What's going to happen here? Well, DoD has said they're going to have a 4-year phase in. But one of the things they also say is that at the end of the 3rd year, they're going to put this 7021 clause into all DoD contracts and solicitations, accepting those for purely COTS. And what that means, the 7021 clause will be the one where when you see it, it will tell you that you cannot accept an award of a contract with that clause unless you have satisfied a CMMC certification assessment for most companies at the level 2, which involves safeguarding of controlled and classified information. Now, this does get complicated, so I'm going to try to keep it simple. So it's possible that you won't actually see a 7021 clause in your contract until 2025, maybe the middle end of the year, or 2026 or later. It's possible. Your problem is that you don't know when that clause will show up in your prime contract. And you also don't know yet, in most cases, when your prime contractor will insist that you demonstrate that you are ready or already have complied. And this is a key point. Prime contractors are ultimately responsible for a supply chain which entirely meets the CMMC security requirements. If a prime contractor signs up to a contract and a sub at any level fails to meet the certification assessment obligations, I don't think the prime can make an award to that sub. And that means there's a gap in the supply chain, and that is a very ugly outcome that no prime and no DoD customer will want. So I've heard reports that essentially on the day that the CMMC program rule became final, some primes started to contact their key vendors to say, where are you? Are you going to be ready? You'd better tell us when you're ready. And I think we'll see more of that. I have already seen evidence, Derek, that the finalization of the program rule and the operative date of December 16th for new CMMC assessments is motivating a sizable number of companies to seek to schedule C3PAO assessments. And it also should motivate many companies to be looking critically at just how far they are and where they are not in satisfying the assessment demands and the underlying security requirements of CMMC Level 2. Now, I'm going on a little longer than I'd like, so I want to make a few key points. There's a lot here, but I am trying to make this understandable. There's going to be a limit on the number of C3PAO resources. So if you think you're going to be ready soon, it's good advice to start talking to a C3PAO to get on the schedule. Another point that must be recognized that's fundamental is this. Until the CMMC program rule is final, it was possible for companies to do a self-assessment under DFAR 7019 and 7020 and to post your self-assessment score on SIPR's Supplier Performance Review System. And you could post a score that was far under the 110 maximum. You could even post a score with a negative number. And you could say in your score that you had a whole bunch of gaps or poems to fill and close. And there was no obligation really to demonstrate that you had to, in every case, close those poems. Well, that is no more, because now that CMMC is in effect, companies will find that poems are allowed in a CMMC regime much less, on many fewer points. You have to have an 88% score overall to be allowed any poems. And poems are allowed only on items of security of lesser importance, 1 point out of a scale of 1, 3, or 5 points. And you must close your poems within 6 months, or suddenly you become ineligible for award. So these are big changes, and they ought to tell companies of every kind and shape that it's time to do a realistic and critical assessment of where you have CUI, whether you're likely to have the 7012 clause or have it already, just how close you are to readiness for assessment, where the gaps are that you need to fill, and then you need the management commitment, the budgets and the resources to get the job done. Waiting around to see if this happens or hoping that it won't happen to you soon, to me, that's a hazardous activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is a good transition, I think, into the other thing I wanted to make sure that we talk about, because timing is relevant here, is the type of data you handle is what you're going to be required to meet, right? So is it going to be in my contract? Is there not? There's people in that scenario that it's not clear. Do I handle CUI? Do I not? Or is it clear? Is it in my contract? And if I'm not going to handle it, I don't have to meet certain requirements. That's why the CMMC program exists the way it does. But there was an update recently to the FAR CUI update side, rule side. And that has some implications, obviously. I know at the time of this recording, it's not everything's obviously clear as day, but what do we expect there? I mean, from your personal opinion, what do we expect there? And, some of those differences.
I am so glad you asked.
You knew it was going to come up.
This morning, in anticipation of this, I decided to take a chance on ChatGPT. And I asked it to tell me what it thought of, this pending FAR rule to protect CUI that would cover civilian agency contractors. And one of the things it told me was it pointed me to an article that was published, I think, in February of 2017 that went on for like 30 pages that talked about the federal CUI program and the prospects for a civilian agency rule, which would, like the DFAR 7012, obligate civilian agency contractors to safeguard CUI. I actually wrote that article. I had literally forgotten that I had written it. ChatGPT, thank you for once. You pointed me to something that I did, or at least the same guy with my name did 7 years ago. And if you like, take a look at my post on LinkedIn about this today. Much of the article is at least still valuable, and much of it shows the sources of frustration and delay that we still deal with. So here's the situation. It's always been an oddity that DoD has been working at such length and effort to not only set requirements for companies or its contractors to protect CUI, but now through CMMC to establish this verification mechanism that essentially enforces the underlying security obligation by telling people that if they can't prove to an independent assessor that they meet the NIST requirements, well, then they can't get new contracts. I mean, fundamentally, for all of its complexity, the CMMC program and contract rules really just enforce obligations that were there before.
Yep.
The problem is that the obligations were not being actually achieved, and DoD continued to suffer the hemorrhage of exfiltration of valuable, sensitive, and unclassified information, and increasingly, DoD contractors became at risk of other nefarious exploits by bad actors, nation state, and otherwise. So DoD took the giant step of taking the requirements and enforcing them, relying upon third-party assessors. But doesn't it strike you as odd that, information of similar importance to every federal agency is routinely shared by the civilian agencies with hundreds of thousands of civilian agency contractors? And yet, for the most part, with some exceptions, there really is no counterpart, generally or prevailing obligation as a contract clause upon civilian agency contractors to protect CUI. And since, DoD is a major customer through civilian agency multiple award schedules of products and services that are sold to civilian agencies, DoD essentially is buying stuff that it relies upon and matters from civilian agencies on contract vehicles that today do not have anything like the 7012 cyber clause or CMMC requirements. So eventually this gap has to close, but it has not been easy, Derek. This contemplation of a FAR CUI contract rule has been underway for at least 6 years. In this article that I wrote in February 2017, I said, they really need to get started on a FAR CUI rule because we need something that's symmetrical and hopefully consistent. Well, they did not long after that. But no rule has come forth. I know it's been drafted. We now know from stuff that the OF, stuff put out by the Office of Management Budget, we now know that there actually is a final civilian agency CUI rule that is somewhere near the point that it could be released as a proposed rule. We don't know what it's going to say. But here are some things that I hope. I hope that it is consistent with DoD's various CUI rules. I don't want something that is asymmetric, imposes different definitions, creates conflicting obligations, or even confusing obligations. Many civilian agency contractors also sell to DoD, and inevitably the same is true in reverse. I also hope that it does not go so far now as does CMMC. In the case of DoD, DoD suppliers should have known that they were actually expected to satisfy the DFAR 7012 cyber requirements no later than December 31st, 2017. If you've been in business with DoD, you really can't, express any surprise that you're now being told to provide adequate security for this information. But that's not true on the civilian agency side. If there are 300,000 companies, as NARA has estimated, the National Archives and Records Administration, which is responsible for the CUI program, if there are 300,000 companies that are going to be subject to this prospective FAR CUI rule, my guess is that no better than a small two-digit percentage, 10% perhaps, actually know this is coming. And so we want to be careful. We want to use the rulemaking process to inform people of what's ahead and give them a chance to complain or advise or criticize or improve. But we also want to make sure that the rule as proposed is something that is actionable, practicable, and achievable. While it is important to provide commensurate security to forms of CUI that are handled by civilian agency contractors, asking for the overwhelming or the impossible will not succeed. I have no problem setting a bar and making that bar high because of the importance of protecting this information, but it needs to be calibrated to kind of who is there and what they can do. I would expect the CUI rule in many respects will align, with what DoD has learned through its own DFAR 7012 program. I do not expect that it will include any verification mechanism such as we have in the CMMC program. Not yet. Now, one thing to consider, is this: in the FAR CUI program, we should appreciate that there's, as of my last count, there are 20 categories of controlled unclassified information and 126 subcategories, Derek.
Mm-hmm.
And of those, a relatively small number are of greatest concern to DoD. There are 5 defense-specific CUI subcategories, and there are 2 export control categories, 8 for intelligence, which most companies at level 2 don't see, and 2 for NATO, which again are unlikely but not impossible to be seen by DoD contractors. However, that means that there's a whole lot of other categories and subcategories, maybe 100 subcategories, where they're much more important to the civilian agencies than they are to DoD, and where civilian agency contractors are much more likely to be dealing with those subcategories of CUI than are DoD contractors. This isn't a scientific estimate. It's more an impression, but I think it's more likely right than not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what that means is that not only are many companies, civilian agency contractors, going to be surprised to learn that they will be expected to secure CUI, they're also going to learn that the range of information which they have to identify, isolate, and protect will probably be much larger than applies even to DoD. And here's another key thing I might have said earlier. It will matter what you have to protect. It will matter who is responsible to designate it. It will matter what the scope is of your information system or organization that will be subject to these protections. And it will matter a lot how you are to protect them. Now, here, I expect that the civilian agency FAR CUI rule will invoke the same NIST standard, SP 800-171, as DoD relies upon still for CMMC. This has 110 safeguards allocated into 14 families of security controls. At root, each safeguard is expressed in just a single sentence. Now, there's a whole elaboration of volumes of additional information on what these safeguards mean and how they're to be done and what evidence you need for assessment and how the assessment is to be done. So there's a lot of literature out there, and there are assessment guides. But I expect that the basic set of security requirements imposed by the civilian agencies by the expected CUI rule will be the same SP 800-171 that DoD contractors are living with now. And I'm going to put an asterisk by that, because it's proven to be much more difficult for DoD contractors than anybody expected at the time this all rolled out. At the time, NIST assumed that most ordinary prudent companies were already doing these things. Well, the truth is proven that fewer ordinary prudent companies are doing these things, or at least fewer of them can demonstrate it than one might have hoped. Now, this is not going to be the end point of security, Derek. SP 800-171, revision 1 came out, I think, in September, approximately September 2016. I may be wrong on a month, but Rev 1 came out in 2016. Rev 1 was the first version of 171 that required the now all-important system security plan, as important today as it was when first introduced. Well, in the actual geopolitical and cybersecurity environment that exists outside the wonderful world of rulemaking, things have actually gotten a lot worse, more complex, and threats have become more diverse. Vulnerabilities much more expansive and distinct than what we might have thought. The consequences of cyber attack, both different and worse. All of which is to say that this baseline of 171 Rev 2, the current baseline, is a bit long in the tooth. And there already is a more demanding baseline that NIST has published, Rev 3. DoD has made a choice that is going to set the baseline for CMMC at Rev 2, and it's even said that it won't implement Rev 3 except by new rulemaking. Here, I think the civilian agencies must follow suit. In other words, they too will adopt, hopefully without too much variation, the Rev 2 baseline, Rev 2 of 171 as the baseline. But no company should think that their security will be set and done by compliance, even if verified through assessment at Rev 2, because these standards and expectations will move and evolve over time, even if slowly. I'll stop. Any questions or comments, Derek?
No, I mean, no. So I think where I would sum that up, and this is kind of always been the soapbox that I'm not going to go on because we don't have that much time. It's not really soapbox. It's just the core principles of all of this is still protecting data, right? And in the data that's more sensitive should be protected with more measures, because you're right, the threats will evolve. And of course, if it's harder for the bad guy, then then maybe they move on or whatever. And the FAR CUI thing is interesting. It feels like sometimes that there's this, well, if everything's CUI, well, if everything is sensitive, then are we getting away from the core principles of what it means to protect data that not matters, but is more sensitive than other data? So I think you're hitting on what I think is peeling the onion back to the core of this. Is someone has to, from the top down, has to say, this is important. This is more important than some of this information. Therefore, we're not going to make you do everything to everything. And the further we get away from those core principles, I think that's where the confusion and the frustration and the can I do this, can we do this gets not totally relatable. I get it. You get it. And I think you're right. I think you're hitting on those things that absolutely need to follow suit for that to then become an achievable outcome that makes it better for a program like this, which is a cybersecurity program for data that we don't want adversaries to have. And again, so there's a lot of different things. We're not going to go on and on about that today.
Well,
but I think you
agree completely. And in fact, when I look back at this 2017 article that bears my name, although I forgot it, it goes on at some length to say, hey, government, DoD, tell us what the stuff is that we're supposed to protect. Yep. Don't just tell us to protect covered defense information. Don't just tell us to protect controlled unclassified information, because it's not our job to actually figure what information is subject to federal law, regulation, or government-wide policy that we have to protect as CUI. That's actually your responsibility. Right. But it hasn't happened. And this means that so many companies are uncertain as to just which of their records must be protected, going how far back, what relationship, if any, or nexus, if any, do they need to have with their DoD or government contract. And to me, this contributes to a lot, not just of frustration, but a great deal of burden, expense upon the financial, human, and technical resources of organizations, which means that if they're covering too much but not very well, they're probably not doing as good a job as they might, and I think should, for the stuff that really does matter. And this problem I complained about at some length in the 2017 article available to you through the miracle of LinkedIn, and I still complain about it.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the world was easier when information was physical, right? And you wanted it from somebody, you had to take it, and that everybody bought into protecting safety and of things when it was all you could touch and feel it. But now that you can't, it becomes and we were all raised the same way. I say this all the time. Everybody went through the same transition into technology as everybody else. It's just now, so I'm not going to go on and out this. This is a great conversation, Bob. It's always very spirited and also comforting in many ways when we chat. So thank you again. I look forward to seeing you next time when we bump into each other. And then obviously this is going to evolve. Things are going to happen. We'll have you on again and we'll just see where it's at. That's kind of been the whole MO of the first 10, 11, 12 episodes we've done, is that all of these conversations are going to come back and we're going to see if we were onto something or if things have changed a little bit. And it's nice to see more clarity, more discussion, more insight from someone like you that's been through it and you've seen it from the start. So thanks again, Bob, and have a great weekend, and we'll chat with you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and make sure to subscribe to the Cuick 10 podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and check us out on YouTube as well. For more information about Cuick Trac, visit our website at www.cuicktrac.com. That's CUICKTRAC.com.